I'm delighted to have here with us Professor Salvatore Babones, Associate Professor at the University of Sydney. Welcome.
My pleasure.
Now, first of all, I'm sure everybody watching this knows who you are, but I didn't know who you were until I watched the video on YouTube that the India Today conclave from 2022, which has hundreds of thousands of views.
With my guru Rajdeep, yes.
Which introduces, first of all, I think to start this off, we have to understand what you do, which is you're a political sociologist, and specifically you're a quantitative comparative sociologist. So what is that?
Absolutely a quantitative comparative sociologist. I'm a bean counter and happy to say it. What we do is we use data about countries to analyze countries. So if you want to produce rankings, you have to have some data about the countries with which to do it. Those data are very complex in their measurement properties. It takes some expertise to use them properly. I think most of the international rankings do not use those data properly. Some of them make very elementary data errors, I think, because they're not coming at India from a statistical perspective. They're coming at India from an ideological perspective. I'm someone who had never even visited India before that very conference you mentioned. That very interview with Rajdeep was my first time setting foot in India. Yet I'd been studying India for years because we can study it through data.
So you've published on economic development in post-socialist transition economies, so have I, by the way, and also quantitative methods for cross-national comparisons. I haven't done that. You're also author or editor of 14 books, including one called The New Authoritarianism, Trump Populism, and the Tyranny of Experts. So we're going to get into this idea of the kind of tyranny of experts. I want to focus on some news that came out yesterday from India. Yesterday, Prime Minister Modi said that India can't run on two laws and that the Uniform Civil Code was part of the Constitution. Now, first of all, tell us what the Uniform Civil Code is.
Uniform Civil Code is what every liberal Westerner would expect, that everybody in a country enjoys the equal protection of the laws. Now, in India, that's not the case. In India, everybody except Muslims enjoys the equal protection of the laws. Muslims, however, are subject to a localized form of Sharia law and Sharia courts for personal law, not for criminal law, but for personal law, like family matters, inheritance. All of that is covered by a Sharia law framework, and that is, I think, something that is grossly out of date in the 21st century. It's something none of us in the West would accept for our own countries, but yet Western liberals, my own colleagues, I'm not insulting Western liberals, I am a Western liberal, seem to accept that for India. And in fact, the reform of the Muslim personal law to make it uniform, make it civil law with the rest of society, is bizarrely viewed as an illiberal reform when it's in India, even though all of us would consider it a liberal reform for our own countries. So
how does that relate to your work?
So first of all, I want to say it's crucially important. It's crucially important for the status of women in India. Right now, the marriage age for girls in India is 18, unless you're Muslim, in which case, in most states in India, it's 15. And often it's younger than that because it's defined as first menstruation. So we have girl marriage going on in India, but only among Muslims. Second, there's an issue of polygamy in India. Polygamy is against the law in India, unless you are Muslim, in which case you can get a dispensation to have multiple wives. Similarly, women inherit in India on the basis of an Islamic formula that gives women much lower levels of inheritance than men in a man's estate when a man dies. These are all part of the Muslim personal law in India that is going to be reformed, presumably, when India moves towards a uniform civil code. Now, my own work on India has been to try to apply an objective Western liberal framework to India. I always emphasize that to people. I'm never saying India for Indians, let India decide, it's a sovereign country, it should have its own standards. I'm sorry, this may be unpopular, I don't believe in that. To me, human rights are human rights, women's rights are women's rights, no matter where you live. What I'd like to do is be applying the same standards of Western liberalism that we apply to our own countries and try to apply them dispassionately, where possible quantitatively, to India.
So it's a huge issue for India. It's also a huge issue for Western audiences, as you point out. So talk a little bit, and I think we should make it clear, you don't have anything to do with the BJP. You're not an advisor. You're not
I've been called,
employed
I've
by
been
them.
accused of having something to do, but no, I have no, I get, well, I'll tell you a great story. When I was in India for the India State Conclave, I was also invited to address the BJP's in-house think tank, the SP Mukherjee Foundation. They didn't pay for my ticket to Delhi. They didn't pay for my hotel while I was in Delhi. They did give me an award, which was very nice of them. No, I don't get any money from the BJP. I'm not Hindu. I'm not Indian. This is simply something that I'm doing as part of my academic research on India.
So, related to the Uniform Civil Code, why is the BJP pursuing this?
This is a great irony. So here we have a party that is often identified as a Hindu nationalist party. I think there are problems with that identification. I would call it a nationalist party that is mostly composed, but not entirely composed, of Hindus. We can leave the semantics aside. It's certainly identified with a religious orientation in India, with a more conservative orientation in India. It's often accused of being somehow pre-modern in India. But in fact, it's the BJP that is modernizing Indian politics. It's a force to bring Indian politics into the 21st century. Now, I can't tell you exactly what their electoral motivation is for bringing up the Uniform Civil Code before the 2024 election. One reason is they're looking for the votes of Muslim women. Most people don't realize, according to the best data we have, which are not that great, there's a lot of non-answer on this question, but according to the best data we have, 19% of Indian Muslims vote for the BJP. Now that far outstrips, for example, the proportion of African Americans who vote Republican. Right? So it's a small number, but it's a large number in the Indian context, where only 49% of Hindus vote for the BJP. So it's not like every Hindu votes BJP, every Muslim votes against it. Okay? Whether they are playing for the votes of Muslim women, or at the same time playing for the votes of Hindu fundamentalists who are upset that Muslims get a personal law and they don't, and feel petulant about it, that, well, if we can't have a Hindu law, Muslims shouldn't be allowed to have a Muslim law. I can't tell you what that balance is. I can't tell you what their motivations are. What I can tell you is it's a liberal reform, whatever reason they're enacting it.
So you talked about status of Muslims, human rights for the Muslim population, attitudes towards Muslims as well. I wonder about their levels of persecution, because you're interested in comparative analysis. And sometimes when I read the Western press, I get a very different view of India than I do when I'm actually in India reading the press in India. So we can talk about that, but in particular, let's talk about the perceived levels of persecution.
This is something that comes up all the time. It's routinely addressed in international speech on India, that India has to improve its human rights, particularly for Muslims. Yet that debate occurs in a data-free environment. We actually have rock-solid survey research data, and this is one of the most high-quality surveys that's ever been done. The Pew Research Center, America's premier survey research organization, surveyed 29,999 Indian households on attitudes towards religion in India.
And that is statistically quite significant.
That's statistically enormous. We usually do surveys of 600 to 800 people. Okay, they did it because they wanted to have a high level of certainty, a nationally representative sample. Survey was conducted in more than a dozen languages. They had an 85% response rate. So we don't have problems of, this is a small sample. This was a fantastically conducted survey. 24% of Indian Muslims report that Muslims face discrimination in India. Now that's virtually the same as the proportion of Christians who say Christians face discrimination, of Hindus who say Hindus face discrimination. How do we understand that number? I mean, 24% on initial thinking sounds bad, right? Well, a quarter of them say they face discrimination. Until we get comparative data. And I told you I'm a comparative quantitative sociologist. So the same survey by the same organization has been done in the United States. Pew Research in the United States found 80% of African Americans report discrimination, 46% of Hispanic Americans, 42% of Asian Americans. Okay? Thus, Asian Americans, one of the most privileged groups in the United States, reports higher levels of discrimination, far higher, almost twice as much as Indian Muslims report. Now, we have lots of ancillary evidence as well. 98% of India's Muslims say they are free to practice their religion in India. 99% of Indian Muslims say that they are proud to be Indian. We have high levels of Muslim in-migration to India from Bangladesh and a little bit from other countries, primarily from Bangladesh. We have virtually no Muslim out-migration from India. In fact, one of the biggest controversies in India today is a controversy over what's called the Citizenship Amendment Act, which may result in Bangladeshi economic migrants to India being repatriated to Bangladesh, where they don't want to go. And so we simply have no quantitative evidence or even circumstantial evidence of repression of Muslims in India. What we do have is an activist narrative driven mainly by Muslim American and Middle Eastern organizations. It's not coming out of India, it's coming out of Western and Middle Eastern sources that give us a narrative that is wholly at odds with the systematic data we have.
So you are writing a new book, you're researching a new book on the origins, the social origins of the BJP.
Well, on Indian democracy and the origins of Indian democracy, but a lot of it's about the BJP, inevitably.
Right. And so you've written an article at risk of being your publicist for you. You've written a really interesting article I recommend you all read, which is about the RSS. So tell us what the RSS and the question you ask is it uniquely Indian?
The RSS is the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. Forgive me,
Excellent
Indians, for mispronouncing that. I don't speak Hindi. The RSS is a civil society organization in India that's probably the most broad-based and most powerful civil society organization in the country. It began as a national rejuvenation movement. That is, it originated in gymnasiums, very much like the Turnverein in 19th century Germany originated in the gymnasiums, and modern gymnastics arises from this movement in Germany of health and well-being for young athletic men who are going to build their nation's future. Okay, in India it was the same thing. The BJP originated in the Hanuman temples. Hanuman is the monkey god. Of course, he's a god of gymnastics, among many other things. And the RSS originated in the Hanuman temples. And the BJP arises out of the RSS. It is, if you will, the political party arm of the RSS. It's not that simple. The relations are more complicated. But Narendra Modi himself is a former volunteer, a lifetime volunteer with the RSS, devoted his whole life to working with the RSS. And the RSS remains a highly influential organization, a mass organization in India. Many people have heard of the World Hindu Council, the VHP. That's also an RSS, part of what's called the Sangh Parivar, the RSS family of organizations. There are trade unions, there are others. Now, the important thing to remember about the BJP and the RSS is these are not regressive movements. These were modernization movements. The BJP is the most thoroughly modern political party in India. Now, you may be surprised to hear that if you think, but isn't their rhetoric highly religious? Well, modernity is not about giving up religion. That may be in our experience in the West. But when I say modern, I mean about modern forms of organization, about using information technology in their campaigns, about having, for example, the BJP won in 2019. Big part of their success was having staff, well-informed staff, fully linked up and networked at virtually every polling place in India to get people to the polls and report on it. The same exact sort of thing that the Democrats, the Republicans do in the United States. I'm sure that Conservative and Labor do that here. The other Indian parties don't. Okay, until the other political parties in India catch up and modernize like the BJP, they won't be able to defeat it in elections.
In fact, we usually have, quite often Shashi Tharoor from the Congress Party comes to this, and last time he gave me last year he gave me exactly the same anecdote, that we wouldn't see Congress return until they modernize as much as the BJP.
I'm a big fan of Shashi Tharoor. I've read virtually all of his books. He's a great intellectual. And Shashi Tharoor is emblematic of what we might call the comprador elite in India. That is, the elite in India who've made their fame and fortune by being interlocutors between the West and India. Shashi Tharoor, of course, was a senior official at the United Nations. He lived much of his life outside of India. He's very fluent in English, famously fluent in English. On the other side of Indian politics is the BJP, which is very much comes out of the national elite in India. Anyone in a political party is elite. And the accusation that the BJP is a Brahmin Banya party, meaning a party of elite Brahmins and tradespeople, Banya, that could be true. Every political party is a Brahma Banya party because you can't run a political party without members of the elite and your technical staff to make it work. Okay. The difference is that the elites out of which the BJP arise and the RSS, being its family organization, are members of the national elite, meaning they speak local languages primarily. They're not necessarily competent in English. If you go to a cocktail party in the Hamptons, a New York Times editor is not going to run into Mohan Bhagwat, the chief of the RSS. He is going to run into Rajiv Gandhi, the senior member of the Gandhi family, the heir apparent of the Gandhi family in the Congress Party. Right? So it's a different social milieu. The BJP arises out of a national rejuvenation movement coming out of the national elite. The Congress Party arises out of a national liberation movement, the Indian National Congress, which arose in this comprador elite. They're very different social groups. And if you want a simple word to describe them, the Congress comes from Englistan. The BJP comes from Hindustan.
Very good. So let's talk about the democracy rankings. Now since your famous/infamous interview, they've actually slid. And there was an article in the Financial Times recently. I'll just read a line from it. Since the BJP defeated the Congress Party in 2014, Modi's backers have stifled free expression across media, civil society and politics, have stoked interreligious tensions. Fear of speaking out against Modi is common in public life. Then they have some stats to back this up. Yeah. Freedom House, a U.S. NGO, has downgraded the country from free in 2021 to partially free. Sweden-based VDEM Institute considers Indian an electoral autocracy alongside the likes of Russia and Turkey.
And China.
And China.
As not an electoral autocracy, but as a non-elected autocracy.
So break those comparisons, those rankings down for me.
The problem is we have to ask, is that true? Every time we hear an allegation, you should be asking, what's the evidence behind it? So all of those adjectives that the Financial Times gave, those are opinions, and those are perceptions based on what they have read. Now, what they've read ultimately goes back to the democracy rankings. So really, they're just putting in words what they've seen in the rankings. So then you have to go to the rankings and unpack them. Where are the rankings coming from? Now, I was notorious in India for saying, quote unquote, India's intellectuals are anti-Indian. Now, that wasn't a slur against intellectuals. That was an explanation of where the rankings come from. Sweden doesn't go and do a ranking of India. Sweden, the Swedish VDEM Institute, sends a survey to Indian political science professors, who then answer the survey and give it back to them, and then some text is put around it. So if you want to know where this knowledge of India is coming from, you have to go back to the original surveys. Now, the VDEM survey of democracy is, and here I'm speaking not as an expert on India, as an expert on surveys. It is an extraordinarily flawed instrument. It's composed of 5 parts. The 2 objective parts are about whether or not officials are elected and about universal suffrage. Virtually every country in the world gets a perfect score. So you have Vietnam, Hong Kong, right, getting perfect scores alongside India for the objective measures of democracy. Then it goes to, are there free and fair elections? And the free and fair elections is judged on a set of technical criteria. So Hong Kong is actually rated by VDEM. Hong Kong today, not Hong Kong before the security law, is rated by VDEM as having freer and fairer elections than India. And the reason is that they describe free and fair elections in purely technical terms. Is the electoral roll complete? Well, in Hong Kong it is. In India, there are disputes. We mentioned Bangladeshi migrants. Are they citizens? Was there violence at the polls? There is no violence at the polls in Hong Kong. The security forces ensure that. In India, inevitably, there's some violence at the polls. Has any party been prohibited? Well, in India, the terrorist-linked Communist Party Maoist has been prohibited. Well, okay, India doesn't get credit for having multi-party elections. And on item after item, they're purely technical criteria for democracy, without ever asking, are the elections competitive? That's not in the VDEM. Can the opposition realistically win? That's not in the VDEM, right? There are a series of purely technical criteria. Now, that gets reified, right? So there's something we might call the charisma of data. They're producing a final number. They have a set of criteria. What number puts you in the autocracy range? What number puts you in the democracy range? And that number puts them in the autocracy range. And so without asking, is India actually run in an autocratic fashion? They're simply saying India's score is 0.6 something, and we define anything below 0.7 something as an autocracy. Therefore, India is an autocracy. Now, an autocracy, if you look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, means arbitrary one-person rule. India doesn't have arbitrary one-person rule. I mean, there's been some degree of centralization of decision-making under Narendra Modi, but that's not unexpected considering he has a majority in parliament. So he doesn't have to have a coalition. So of course, decision-making's been centralized in the PM's office. But nobody is suggesting that nobody reasonable is suggesting that India fits the Oxford English Dictionary definition of an autocracy. The only reason it's called that is this charisma of statistics. VDEM produced a number. That number is in their autocracy range. Therefore, India is an autocracy.
Really thorough explanation and fascinating. Talk me through the Freedom House.
Freedom House is a similar index, but it's an index of freedom, not really of democracy. Again, they have a point range for free, partly free, and unfree. So what happened was India, in their survey, dipped below the point range for free and went into the partly free range. Again, it's a series of questions. It's just a survey instrument that asks, this time it asks experts on India instead of asking actual Indians. Asks them a series of questions about India. Now, a lot of this, again, has to do with impressions. So, for example, questions are things like, is the press free to report as it wishes? Well, if experts now say no, well, why are they saying no? Is that really true? I don't think it's true. I watch the Indian media every day. Experts are asked, were the elections fair? Okay. Experts are asked, is the Electoral Commission unbiased? Now, these again are qualitative impressions of the experts who are answering the survey, which then gets summed up into a number. And I'll use that phrase again, the magic of data, the charisma of data, that the number suggests that there's something quantitative going on here, when in fact it's a survey of expert opinion. And when experts have been hearing, these are primarily Western experts in VDEM, when experts have been hearing relentlessly for the past 9 years, democracy is under threat in India, Muslims are threatened in India, press freedom is threatened in India, of course this shapes their judgment. And I'm not surprised that they now judge that India is not as free as it was, because they read the newspaper just like you and I.
It's interesting that you use that word, opinion and editorializing, which I think is dangerous for example, the Financial Times to be doing. What about the press freedom index?
Yeah, the press freedom is really notorious.
161
out of 180 countries. First of all, anyone who watches Indian news or reads a newspaper, to think that India is one of the very worst countries in the world for reporters is simply, it's laughable. It really is ridiculous.
But what about February tax inspectors raided the BBC?
So we get into detail. So,
right?
so the text that you see in their report is text that's adduced to justify the number they give. The number comes from a survey and from a quantitative analysis. Now, one of the big indicators there is safety for journalists. Okay, we know quantitatively that journalists are much safer in India than in the United States. They're safer than in the rest of the developing world. In fact, the only region of the world where journalists are safer, and this is from data from the Committee to Protect Journalists, the only region of the world where they're safer than India is Western Europe. Okay, so after Western Europe, you then go down to India as being just about the safest region of the world. Australia and New Zealand as well. But outside the usual suspects, India is extraordinarily safe. Safer than the United States. Yet, in the RSF index, India is given a very low score for press freedom because they don't divide the number of murders of journalists by population. Okay, well, of course more journalists are killed in India than in any country outside China. There are more people with black hair in India than in any country outside China. There are more people with left feet in India than in any country outside China. You have to go to the data. Okay, similarly, there are a series of questions about, has the government ever imprisoned a journalist? And it's not phrased as what's the rate of imprisonment? Have they ever? Okay, well, first, in a country of 1.4 billion people, some journalist has been imprisoned. Second, India is an English-speaking country where things get reported broadly, as opposed to, do we really know if a journalist was imprisoned in Burundi? Most of us have very low consciousness of Burundi. So in India, it's all very public, it's all very reported. So these structural problems. Then once the number comes through the charisma of data, I'm sorry to keep using that phrase, through the charisma of statistics, then there's a look to justify, well, how can we justify this 161? And so there's a search for what has India done that could, in ordinary people's minds who aren't statisticians, justify this number. And there have been issues in India. The tax rate on the BBC offices does not make India look good. Now, is BBC paying their taxes or not? I have no idea, but it certainly is not a good look for India. That said, tax raids on journalists are nothing unique to India, so I could just as well say in the United States, when a prominent critic of the Biden administration was giving testimony at Congress on freedom of the press under Biden, there was a tax rate on his home.
Right.
So in the United States now, why isn't that in the United States report? Because the US number on press freedom is very high. There's no need to find something to justify it. The India number on press freedom is very low. There's a search for something to justify it. I am not defending the rate on the BBC, the tax rate on the BBC in India. I have no idea whether that was just a coincidence, if it was politically motivated. I can't answer that question. What I can say is these things happen in developed countries too. What we need to know is the systematic data, not the incident that is being used to justify the number being reported.
I could ask you about another one about the International Religious Freedom Ratings, but what I actually want to ask you is, how would you design a survey that you think would be a fairer representation than what we've seen from VDEM, from Freedom House? And pick your issue, press freedom or religious freedom.
Look, on democracy, I think what we need is a simple, direct, intuitive understanding of democracy. How often does the ruling party lose? How closely fought are elections? That tells me much more about a democracy. I mean, when I see a democracy like Ivory Coast, in Ivory Coast, in the last presidential election, the president won 98% of the vote. His main opponent was exiled just before the election. All right, they rate higher than India.
Right.
For democracy. Now, from an intuitive standpoint, I know that a country where elections are very closely fought and won in a razor-thin margin are more democratic than countries where someone wins 98% of the vote. And I think that's a better way to look at democracy. Inevitably, when we go to surveys, however, and these are expert surveys, these are questions being asked of experts, everything gets conditioned on what questions we ask. So something that's very controversial in India, this survey was conducted by Sweden's Bharatiya Democracy Institute Foundation. They don't ask, is the head of state elected or inherited? Because of course in Sweden, there's a monarchy.
Right.
They don't ask, is there an official state religion? Because of course in Sweden, it's official Lutheranism. Right? So these are not, in the Swedish model of what's a democracy, they don't care about heads of state or state religions, because that would make them look bad. And whenever you get into a survey with a questionnaire, that ends up being simply an artifact of what's asked on the questionnaire. The Swedes don't think to ask, is it realistic for a competing party to win? Instead, they think to ask, was there violence at the polls? Because of what they're concerned with in Sweden. So much better to go to a pragmatic, direct question, is there really a competitive election? And let the rest sort itself out, because honestly, we don't really care whether India is rated number 1, number 10, or number 25 in democracy. We don't need this kind of fine gradation. What we need to know is India a real bona fide democracy, yes or no? And I think the competitive elections and the open process through which they're conducted simply says yes.
You have given us so much to think about, a lot of food for thought, and I really thank you very much for your time, Professor Babones. It's been an absolute delight to have you here at the India Global Forum. So
Great
thank
to
you.
Be here. Great
thank
to
you.
be
Let's
here.
give him a round of applause, ladies and gentlemen.